Welcome to session 4 of Hatchet. This is chapters 8 through 10. Enjoy. At first he thought it was a growl. In the still darkness of the shelter in the middle of the night, his eyes came open and he was awake and he thought there was a growl. But it was the wind, a medium wind in the pines, and it made some sound that brought him awake. He sat up and was hit with the smell. It terrified him. The smell was one of rot, some musty rot that made him think only of graves with cobwebs and dust and old death. His nostrils widened and he opened his eyes wider, but he could see nothing. It was too dark, too hard dark, with clouds covering even the small light from the stars, and he could not see. But the smell was alive and full in the shelter. He thought of the bear, thought of Bigfoot and every monster that he'd ever seen and every fright movie he'd ever watched, and his heart hammered in his throat. Then he heard the slithering, a brushing sound, a slithering brushing sound near his feet, and he kicked as hard as he could, kicked out and threw the hatchet at the sound, a noise coming from his throat. But the hatchet missed, sailed into the wall where it hit the rocks with a shower of sparks, and his leg was instantly torn with pain, as if 100 needles had been driven into it. Ah! Now he screamed with the pain and fear and skittered on his backside up into the corner of the shelter, breathing through his mouth, straining to see, to hear. The slithering moved again. He thought toward him at first, and terror took him, stopping his breath. He felt he could see a low, dark form, a bulk in the darkness, a shadow that lived, but now it moved away. Slithering and scraping, it moved away, and he saw, or thought he saw it, go out the door opening. He lay on his side for a moment and then pulled a rasping breath in and held it, listening for the attacker to return. When it was apparent that the shadow wasn't coming back, he felt the calf of his leg where the pain was centered and spreading to fill the whole leg. His fingers gingerly touched a group of needles that had been driven through his pants and into the fleshy part of his calf. They were stiff and very sharp on the ends, and that stuck out. And he knew then what the attacker had been. A porcupine had stumbled into his shelter, and when he had kicked it in, the thing had slapped him with its tail of quills. He touched each quill carefully. The pain made it seem as if dozens of them had been slammed into his leg, but there were only 8, pinning the cloth against his skin. He leaned back against the wall for a minute. He couldn't leave them in. They had to come out, but just touching them made the pain more intense. So fast, he thought, so fast things change. When he'd gone to sleep, he had satisfaction, and in just a moment it was all different. He grasped at one of the quills, held his breath, and jerked. It sent pain signals to his brain in tight waves, but he grabbed another, pulled it, and then another quill. When he had pulled 4 of them, he stopped for a moment. The pain had gone from being a pointed injury pain to spreading in a hot smear up his leg, and it made him catch his breath. Some of the quills were driven in deeper than others, and they tore when they came out. He breathed deeply twice, let half of the breath out, and went back to work. Jerk, pause, jerk, and 3 more times before he lay back in the darkness, done. The pain filled his leg now, and with it came new waves of self-pity. Sitting alone in the dark, his leg aching, some mosquitoes finding him again, he started crying. It was all too much, just too much, and he couldn't take it. Not the way it was. I can't take it this way, alone with no fire and in the dark, and the next time it might be something worse, maybe a bear. And it wouldn't be just quills in the leg, it would be worse. I can't do this, he thought again and again. I can't. Brian pulled himself up until he was sitting upright back in the corner of the cave. He put his head down on his arms across his knees, with stiffness taking his left leg, and cried until he was cried out. He did not know how long it took, but later he looked back on this time of crying in the corner of the dark cave and thought of it as when he learned the most important rule of survival, which was that feeling sorry for yourself didn't work. It wasn't just that it was wrong to do or that it was considered incorrect. It was more than that. It didn't work. When he sat alone in the darkness and cried and was done, all done with it, nothing had changed. His legs still hurt and it was still dark, and he was still alone, and the self-pity had accomplished nothing. At last he slept again, but already his pattern was changing, and the sleep was light, a resting doze more than a deep sleep, with small sounds awaking him twice in the rest of the night. In the last doze period before daylight, before he awakened finally with the morning light and the clouds of new mosquitoes, he dreamed. This time it was not of his mother and not of the secret, but of his father at first, and then of his friend Terry. In the initial segment of the dream, his father was standing at the side of a living room looking at him, and it was clear from his expression that he was trying to tell Brian something. His lips moved, but there was no sound, not a whisper. He waved his hands at Brian and made gestures in front of his face as if he were scratching something, and he worked to make a word with his mouth, but at first Brian could not see it. Then the lips made a shape, but no sound came. Ma. Brian could not hear it, could not understand it, and he wanted to so badly. It was so important to understand his father, to know what he was saying. He was trying to help, trying so hard, and when Brian couldn't understand, he looked cross, the way he did when Brian asked questions more than once, and he faded. Brian's father faded into a fog place Brian could not see, and the dream was almost over, or seemed to be, when Terry came. He was not gesturing to Brian, but was sitting in the park at a bench looking at a barbecue pit, and for a time nothing happened. Then he got up and poured some charcoal from a bag into the cooker, and then some starter fluid, and he took a flick type of lighter and lit the fluid. When it was burning and the charcoal was at last getting hot, he turned, noticing Brian for the first time in the dream. He turned and smiled and pointed to the fire as if to say, "See, it's a fire." But it meant nothing to Brian except that he wished he had a fire. He saw a grocery sack on the table next to Terry. Brian thought it must contain hot dogs and chips and mustard, and he could think only of food. But Terry shook his head and pointed again to the fire, and twice more he pointed to the fire, made Brian see the flames, and Brian felt his frustration and anger rise, and he thought, all right, I see the fire, but so what? I don't have a fire. I know about fire. I know I need a fire. I know that. His eyes opened, and there was a light in the cave, a gray dim light of morning. He wiped his mouth and tried to move his leg, which had stiffened like wood. There was thirst and hunger, and he ate some raspberries from the jacket. They had spoiled a bit and seemed softer and mushier, but still had rich sweetness. He crushed the berries against the roof of his mouth with his tongue and drank the sweet juice as it ran down his throat. A flash of metal caught his eye, and he saw his hatchet in the sand, where he had thrown it at the porcupine in the dark. He scooched up, wincing a bit when he bent his stiff leg and crawled to where the hatchet lay. He picked it up and examined it and saw a chip in the top of the head. The nick wasn't too large, but the hatchet was important to him, was his only tool, and he should not have thrown it. He should keep it in his hand and make a tool of some kind to help push an animal away. Make a staff, he thought, or a lance, and save the hatchet. Something came then, a thought, as he held the hatchet, something about the dream and his father and Terry, but he couldn't pin it down. Ugh! He scrambled out and stood in the morning sun and stretched his back muscles and his sore leg. The hatchet was still in his hand, and as he stretched and raised it over his head, it caught the first rays of morning sun. The first faint light hit the silver of the hatchet, and it flashed a brilliant gold in the light, like fire. That is it, he thought, what they were trying to tell me. Fire. The hatchet was the key to it all. When he threw the hatchet at the porcupine in the cave and missed and hit the stone wall, it had showered sparks, a golden shower of sparks in the dark, as golden with fire as the sun was now. The hatchet was the answer. That's what his father and Terry had been trying to tell him. Something he could get fire from the hatchet. The sparks would make fire. Brian went back into the shelter and studied the wall. It was some form of a chalky granite or sandstone, but embedded in it were larger pieces of a darker stone, a harder and darker stone. It only took him a moment to find where the hatchet had struck. The steel had nicked into the edge of one of the darker stone pieces. Brian turned the head backwards so he could strike with the flat rear of the hatchet and hit the black rock gently. Too gently, and nothing happened. He struck harder, a glancing blow, and 2 or 3 weak sparks skipped off the rock and died immediately. He swung harder, held the hatchet so it would hit a longer sliding blow, and the black rock exploded in fire. Sparks flew so heavily that several of them skittered and jumped on the sand beneath the rock, and he smiled and struck again and again. There could be fire here, he thought. I will have a fire, he thought, and he struck again. I will have fire from the hatchet. Chapter 9. Brian found it was a long way from sparks to fire. Clearly, there had to be something for the sparks to ignite, some kind of tinder or kindling. But what? He brought some dried grass in, tapped sparks into it, and watched them die. He tried small twigs, breaking them into little pieces, but that was worse than the grass. Then he tried a combination of the two, grass and twigs. Nothing. He had no trouble getting sparks, but the tiny bits of hot stone or metal, he couldn't tell which they were, just sputtered and died. He needed something finer, something soft and fine and fluffy to catch the bits of fire. Shredded paper would be nice, but he had no paper. So close, he said aloud, so close. He put the hatchet back in his belt and went out of the shelter, limping on his sore leg. There had to be something. There had to be. Man had made fire. There had been fire for thousands, millions of years. There had to be a way. He dug into his pockets and found the $20 bill in his wallet. Paper. Worthless paper out here. But if he could get a fire going. He ripped the 20 into tiny pieces and made a pile of pieces and hit sparks into them. Nothing happened. They just wouldn't take the sparks. But there had to be a way, some way to do it. Not 20 feet to his right, leaning out over the water, were birches, and he stood looking at them for a full half-minute before they registered in his mind. They were a beautiful white with bark like clean, slightly speckled paper. Paper. He moved to the trees where the bark was peeling from the trunks. It lifted in tiny tendrils, almost fluffs. Brian plucked some of them loose and filled them in his fingers and rolled them in his fingers. They seemed flammable, dry, and nearly powdery. He pulled and twisted bits of the trees, packing them in one hand while he picked them with the other, picking and gathering, until he had a wad close to the size of a baseball. Then he went back into the shelter and arranged the ball of birch bark, peelings at the base of the black rock. As an afterthought, he threw the remains of the $20 bill. He struck, and a stream of sparks fell into the bark and quickly died. But this time, one spark fell on one small hair of dry bark, almost a thread of bark, and it seemed to glow a bit brighter before it died. The material had to be finer. There had to be soft, incredibly fine nest for the sparks. I must make a home for the sparks, he thought, a perfect home, or they won't stay and they won't make fire. He started ripping the bark, using his fingernails at first, and when that didn't work, he used the sharp edge of the hatchet, cutting the bark in thin slivers, hairs so fine they were almost not there. It was painstaking work, slow work, and he stayed with it for over 2 hours. Twice he stopped for a handful of berries, and once to go to the lake for a drink. Then back to work, the sun on his back, until at last he had a ball of fluff as big as a grapefruit, dry birch bark fluff. He positioned his spark nest, as he thought of it, at the base of the rock, and used his thumb to make a small depression in the middle, and he slammed the back of the hatchet down across the black rock. A cloud of sparks rained down, most of them missing the nest. But some, perhaps 30 or so, hid in the depression, and of those 6 or 7 found fuel and grew, smoldered, and caused the bark to take on a red glow. Then they went out. Close, he was close. He repositioned the nest, made a new and smaller dent with his thumb, and struck again. More sparks, a slight glow, and then nothing. It's me, he thought. I'm doing something wrong. I do not know this. A cave dweller would have had fire by now. Cro-Magnon man would have fire by now. But I don't know this. I don't know how to make a fire. Maybe there's not enough sparks. He settled the nest in place once more and hit the rock with a series of blows as fast as he could. The sparks flowed like a golden waterfall. At first they seemed to take. There were several. Many sparks that found life and took briefly, but they died. Starved. He leaned back. They're like me. They're starving. It wasn't quantity. There were plenty of sparks, but they needed more. I would kill, he thought suddenly, for a book of matches. Just one book, just one match I would kill. What makes fire? He thought back to school, to all those science classes. Had he ever learned what made a fire? Did a teacher ever stand up and say, "This is what makes fire"? He shook his head and tried to focus his thoughts. What did it take? You have to have fuel, he thought, and he had that. The bark was fuel. Oxygen. There had to be air. He needed to add air. He had to fan on it, to blow on it. He made the nest ready again, held the hatchet backward, tensed, and struck 4 quick blows. Sparks came down, and he leaned forward as fast as he could and blew. Too hard. They were bright and almost intense glow, and then it was gone. He had blown it out. Another set of strikes, more sparks. He leaned and blew, but gently this time, holding back and aiming the stream of air from his mouth to hit the brightest spot. 5 or 6 sparks had fallen in a tight mass of bark hair, and Brian centered his thoughts and efforts there. The sparks grew with his gentle breath. The red glow moved from the sparks themselves into the bark and moved and grew and became worms, glowing red worms that crawled up the bark hairs and caught other threads of bark and grew until there was a pocket of red as big as a quarter, a glowing red coal of heat. And when he ran out of breath and paused to inhale, the red ball suddenly burst into flame. "Fire!" he yelled. "I have fire! I've got it! I've got it! I've got it!" But the flames were thick and oily and burning fast, consuming the ball of bark as fast as if it were gasoline. He had to feed the flames and keep them going. Working as fast as he could, he carefully placed the dried grass and wood pieces, and he had tried at first on top of the bark and was gratified to see them take. But they would go fast. He needed more and more. He could not let the flames go out. He ran from the shelter to the pines and started breaking off the low, dead, small limbs. Then he threw in the shelter, went back for more, and threw those in, and squatted to break and feed the hungry flames. When the small wood was going well, he went out and found larger wood, and he did not relax until that was going. Then he leaned against the wood brace of his door opening and smiled. "I have a friend," he thought. "I have a friend now, a hungry friend, but a good one. I have a friend named Fire. Hello, Fire." The curve of the rock back made an almost perfect drawing flue that carried the smoke up through the cracks of the roof, but held the heat. If he kept the fire small, it would be perfect and would keep anything like the porcupine from coming through the door again. A friend and a guard, he thought. So much for a little spark, a friend and a guard from a tiny spark. He looked around and wished he had somebody to tell this thing, to show this thing that he had done. But there was nobody. Nothing but the trees and the sun and the breeze and the lake. Nobody. And he thought, rolling thoughts with the smoke curling up over his head and the smile still half on his face, he thought, I wonder what they're doing now. I wonder what my father is doing now. I wonder what my mother is doing now. I wonder if she is with him. Chapter 10. He could not at first leave the fire. It was so precious to him, so close and sweet a thing, the yellow and red flames brightening the dark interior of the shelter, the happy crackle of the dry wood as it burned, but he could not leave it. He went to the trees and brought in as many dead limbs as he could chop off and carry, and when he had a large pile of them, he sat near the fire, though it was getting into the warm middle part of the day, and he was hot, and he broke them in small pieces and fed the fire. "I will not let you go out," he said to himself, to the flames, "not ever." And so he sat through a long part of the day, keeping the flames even, eating from his stock of raspberries, leaving to drink from the lake when he was thirsty. In the afternoon, toward the evening, with his face smoke-smeared and his skin red from the heat, he finally began to think ahead of what he needed to do. He would need a large wood pile to get through the night. It would be almost impossible to find wood in the dark, so he had to have it all in and cut and stacked before the sun went down. Brian made certain the fire was banked with new wood, and then he went out of the shelter and searched for good fuel supply. Up the hill from the campsite, the same windstorm that left him a place to land the plane, had that only been 3-4 days ago, had dropped 3 large white pines across each other. They were dead now, dry and filled with weather-dried dead limbs, enough for many days. He chopped and broke and carried wood back to the camp, stacking the pieces under the overhang until he had what he thought to be an enormous pile, as high as his head and 6 feet across the base. Between trips, he added small pieces to the fire to keep it going, and on one of the trips to get wood, he noticed an added advantage of the fire. When he was in the shade of the trees breaking limbs, the mosquitoes swarmed on him as usual, but when he came to the fire or near the shelter where the smoke eddied and swirled, the insects were gone. It was a wonderful discovery. The mosquitoes had nearly driven him mad, and thought of being rid of them lifted his spirits. On another trip, he looked back and saw the smoke curling up through the trees and realized for the first time that he now had a means to make a signal. He could carry a burning stick and build a signal and perhaps attract attention, which meant more wood, and still more wood. There did not seem to be an end to the wood he would need, and he spent all the rest of the afternoon into dusk making wood trips. At dark, he settled in again for the night next to the fire with a stack of short pieces ready to put on, and he ate the rest of the raspberries. During all the work of the day, his leg had loosened, but it still ached a bit, and he rubbed it and watched the fire and thought for the first time since the crash that he might be getting a handle on things. He might be starting to do something other than just sit. He was out of food, but he could look tomorrow, and he would get a signal fire tomorrow and get more wood tomorrow. The fire cut the night coolness and settled him back into sleep, thinking of tomorrow. He slept hard and wasn't sure what awakened him, but his eyes came open and he stared into the darkness. The fire had burned down and looked out, but he stirred it with a piece of wood and found a bed of coals still glowing hot and red. With small pieces of wood and careful blowing, he soon had the blaze going again. It had been close. He had to be sure to try and sleep in short intervals so he could keep the fire going, and he tried to think of a way to regulate his sleep, but it made him sleepy to think about it, and he was just going under again when he heard the sound outside. It was not unlike the sound of the porcupine, something slithering and being dragged across the sand. But when he looked out the door opening, it was too dark to see anything. Whatever it stopped making the sound in a few moments, and he thought he heard something sloshing into the water at the shoreline. But he had the fire now and plenty of wood, so he wasn't as worried as he had been the night before. He dozed, slept for a time, and awakened again just at dawn gray light, and added wood to the still smoking fire before standing outside and stretching. Standing with his arms stretched over his head and the tight knot of hunger in his stomach, he looked toward the lake and saw the tracks. They were strange, a main center line up from the lake in the sand, with claw marks to the side leading to a small pile of sand and then going back down to the water. He walked over and squatted near them and studied them and tried to make sense of them. Whatever had made the tracks had some kind of a flat, dragging bottom in the middle and was apparently pushed along by the legs that stuck out to the side. Up from the water to a small pile of sand and then back down to the water. Some animal, some kind of water animal that came to the sand To do what? To do something with the sand, to play and make a pile in the sand? He smiled. City boy, he thought. You city boy with your city ways. He made a mirror in his mind, a mirror of himself, and saw how he must look. A city boy with city ways sitting in the sand, trying to read the tracks and not knowing and not understanding. Why would anything wild come from the water to play in the sand? Not that way. Animals weren't that way. They just didn't waste time that way. It had come up from the water for a reason, a good reason, and he must try to understand the reason. He must change to fully understand the reason himself, or he would not make it. It had come up from the water for a reason, and the reason, he thought, squatting, the reason had to do with this pile of sand. He brushed the top off gently with his hand, but found only damp sand. Still, there must be a reason, and he carefully kept scraping and digging until, about 4 inches down, he suddenly came into a small chamber in the cool, damp sand, and there lay eggs, many eggs, almost perfectly round eggs, the size of table tennis balls, and he laughed then because he knew. It had been a turtle. He had seen a show on television about sea turtles that came up into beaches and laid their eggs in the sand. There must be freshwater lake turtles that did the same. Maybe snapping turtles. He had heard of snapping turtles. They became fairly large, he thought. It must have been a snapper that came up in the night when he heard that noise that awakened him. She must have come and laid the eggs. Food. More than eggs, more than knowledge, more than anything, this was food. His stomach tightened and rolled and made a noise as he looked at the eggs, as if his stomach belonged to somebody else or had seen the eggs with its own eyes and was demanding food. The hunger always there had been somewhat controlled and dormant when there was nothing to eat, but with the eggs came the scream to eat. His whole body craved food with such an intensity that it quickened his breath. He reached into the nest and pulled the eggs out one at a time. There were 17 of them, each as round as a ball and white. They had leathery shells that gave instead of breaking when he squeezed them. When he had them heaped on the sand in a pyramid, he'd never felt so rich. Somehow, he suddenly realized that he did not know how to eat them. He had a fire, but no way to cook them, no container, and he never thought of eating a raw egg. He'd had an uncle named Carter, his father's brother, who always put an egg in a glass of milk and drank it in the morning. Brian had watched him do it once, just once, and when the running part of the white left the glass and went into his uncle's mouth and down the throat in a single gulp, Brian almost lost everything he'd ever eaten. Still, he thought, as his stomach moved toward his backbone, he became less and less fussy. Some natives in the world ate grasshoppers and ants. If they could do that, he could eat a raw egg down. He picked one up and tried to break the shell and found it surprisingly tough. Finally, using the hatchet, he sharpened a stick and poked a hole in the egg. He widened the hole with his finger and looked inside. It was just an egg. It had a dark yellow yolk and not so much white as he thought there would be. It's just an egg. Food. Just an egg that he had to eat. Raw. He looked out across the lake and brought the egg to his mouth and closed his eyes and sucked and squeezed the egg at the same time and swallowed as fast as he could. Ugh! It had a greasy, almost oily taste, but it was still an egg. His throat tried to throw it back up and his whole body seemed to convulse with it, but his stomach took it and held it and demanded more. The second egg was easier, and by the third one he had no trouble at all. It just slid down. He ate 6 of them. He could have easily eaten all of them and not been full, but a part of him said to hold back, to save the rest. He could not believe the hunger. The eggs had awakened it fully, roaringly, so that it tore at him. After the 6th egg, he ripped the shell open and licked the inside clean, then went back and ripped the other 5 open and licked them out as well, and wondered if he could eat the shells. There must be some food value in them, and when he tried, they were too leathery to chew, and he couldn't get them down. He stood away from the eggs for a moment, literally stood and turned away so that he could not see them. If he looked at them, he would have to eat more. He would store them in the shelter and eat only one a day. He fought the hunger down and controlled it. He would take them now and store them and save them and eat one a day. And he realized as he thought that he had forgotten that they might come. The searchers. Surely they would come before he could eat all the eggs in one day. He had forgotten to think about them, and that wasn't good. He had to keep thinking of them because if he forgot them and did not think of them, they might forget about him. And he had to keep hoping. He had to keep hoping.